Imagine being on a busy highway. You are in your car, and as you know, you're supposed to keep up with the flow of traffic. You're in the left lane, but you realize you need to exit on the right in less than a mile. What do you do? I think life is like that sometimes. We need to make a change, but finding a way to do that when you're going 70 or 80 miles an hour is quite hard work. But completely stopping is not an option either. We can put on our signal light and hope, but we can't assume that traffic will just part for us like the Red Sea parted for the Israelites. We can say we're going to change, but how do we do that when we're just trying to keep up? Well, that's where Jesus often enters in. As Jesus does, Jesus breaks in, breaks down, and breaks up whatever is going on. We often hear this story, the story of Jesus cleansing the temple, and look down on those people who are selling things and the money changers. But what if they're kind of just like us sometimes? Kind of trapped in how things are, just going with the flow, struggling to figure out how to survive in a world that doesn't seem to want them to. But then there's other folks involved too. There are some people that are certainly making bank in this temple. As Jesus says, it has become a den of robbers. Jesus invokes these words from the prophet Jeremiah and calls out the injustice that is happening there. As Marcus Borg and John Crossan said, the people's everyday injustice makes them robbers. And they think the temple is their safe house, a den, a hideaway, or a place of security. Several commentators pointed out that it wasn't primarily those selling and changing money that were the problem here, because they weren't the ones making the big profits, much like those who work for large corporations today. As the wealth poured into the temple, much of it ultimately ended up in the pockets of the high priestly families. And this was done without being questioned, because it was integrated into their religious system. Religion just became another place of financial exploitation, with no change happening in the lives of those who worshiped. This kind of reminds me of one of those things that kicked off the Reformation, the selling of indulgences, the selling of a ticket into heaven for just the right price. I think this is a problem for Jesus, not only because the poor travelers around them are being mistreated, but also because the way they are being mistreated is representing God, and that's not who God is. I wonder, for the people that were seeing the selling and the changing of money in this temple space that was meant to be a space for all people, what kind of message did this send to people that maybe were coming for the first time? Or people who would come year after year and keep seeing that same thing? So Jesus interrupts. He breaks the cycle. He reveals evil. And if there's anything that evil hates, it's exposure. Evil cannot persist in the light. That was part of the message of the first chapter of John, which we covered a few weeks ago. And it is true as it continues in this chapter. Now, I want to step back for a moment here and acknowledge that there are actually at least 4 sermons that I could preach right now. And for the sake of all of us, and those of us who want to get to lunch, I won't do that. But I did come across this funny comic this week where Jesus was addressing a group of people. He said, okay, so I need you guys to pay attention, because I really don't want 4 versions of this. And there's poor old John. It's a bit of a challenge when we have 4 different versions of a story, just like an investigator listening to the 4 stories of different eyewitnesses. What do we do when we have these different details emerging? Well, Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell a very similar story, although there are some individual parts. But John's version is really different. And since we're journeying through the Gospel of John this season, I think that would be a good place to start. And also, when things are different in the Bible, that's a good clue to pay attention. Now, these early stories in John's Gospel help us to understand a little bit more about who Jesus is and what Jesus is about. In this case, we see Jesus breaking the cycles of injustice and putting an end to the exploitation of the poor. Another way to talk about the breaking of cycles or putting the end to something is death. But as Rachel Held Evans once said, we are a resurrection people, so we do not fear death. We know that out of death comes new life. One of the important themes that is brought out here is this theme of death to life. That is Jesus' path to salvation. Because at the end of the story, which we didn't hear too much about earlier, but at the end of the story, once the temple is cleared of the money changers and those selling animals, children are welcomed in. It can be a place of prayer for all the nations, as Mark put it. And Luke tells the story of the teachings of Jesus being heard instead of just the clamoring of animals and money changing. And this gives me hope. But there's something more that we can learn from John's version. Our theme for this year is the peace table, and our focus is on peace and peacemaking, what peace might look like today and what it might mean to be a peacemaker in our world today. The Mennonite tradition that many of us have belonged to, either for a long time or a short time, we often look to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5-7 for inspiration on peacemaking. Because Jesus offers these nonviolent, active forms of resistance to injustice. But I think this story here, this story of Jesus cleansing the temple, might actually be a great story of nonviolence. Except there's one little problem, one little hurdle to overcome. And it's this idea that shows up specifically in John's Gospel of Jesus using a whip. But don't worry, there's a book for that. Fight Like Jesus by Jason Porterfield. He writes, for Jesus, pacifism could never be equated with passiveness. Refusing to act violently was never a refusal to act. When all was not right, Jesus never sat idly by, doing nothing. Love compelled him to act. Love moved him to resist evil with every fiber of his being. But how can that be true with this whip? Well, let's look a little more carefully at that. What it actually says is there was something like a whip. You see, Jesus goes into the temple and assembles something after entering the temple that resembles a whip. This was likely made from the rushes and reeds that were used as bedding for the animals. Such a material, when assembled like a whip, would not be harmful to people at all. On the contrary, this was actually something that was probably more similar to what those who herded animals would use to move them along. So whipping the ground with this whip would have caused the animals to simply move out. And I assume that their owners would also move out with them, chasing them down, trying to recapture their livelihood. No whipping of people would have been necessary. And if Jesus had acted violently in the temple, the guards of the temple surely would have arrested him. And this would have given Rome all the reason to treat Jesus as a violent insurrectionist, which they did not. Rome was extra sensitive to the potential revolts that happened during the Passover, so their lack of action says something about what Jesus did too. I think we can conclude here that Jesus' action interrupted the injustice. It did not add to it. Ultimately, the purpose of the temple and the festivals that would go on there was to bring people into the presence of God. Jesus, as the presence of God in the flesh, was not about to let evil persist or to take on the tools of evil to accomplish his calling. So Jesus nonviolently agitates the system and allows nature to take its course. And with the temple cleared out, there was room for people to gather once again, as it was intended to be. But our story in John does not end with a pretty little bow. I think because this story comes early on in John, whereas in all the other Gospels, this story comes right at the end of Jesus' ministry, we are given something to ponder for a while. Jesus says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Puzzled, those in attendance said back to him, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years. I can think of some highways that are like that too. "And you're saying you will raise it up in 3 days?" But as I imagine Jesus doing this, I don't think he was gesturing to this temple. I think he was gesturing to say, this temple. As later followers of Jesus would comment in verses 21 and 22, Jesus was talking about his body. He was speaking about death and resurrection, death to life once again. And this is the uncomfortable reality that we have to wrestle with in this passage. Whether it be a personal death to our ego and our pride, or a death to the systems and organizations that do harm, Jesus invites death so that new life can be reborn in its place. And this is where our hope lies. Our world feels pretty messed up right now. As the Bible puts it, we are surrounded by wars and rumors of wars. And yet this is what empire does. It's empire doing empire. But we are not powerless, and we are not without hope. Jesus gives us models of resistance, of community building, and of loving our neighbor. And Jesus reminds us that even the mightiest of institutions, like the temple in his time, could find death and new life. He didn't do that as a threat, but it was a promise. My prayer for us is that the Spirit would guide us into new life. That might mean we have to let some things die, or maybe hurry them along, like the animals out of the temple. But I also pray that this would lead us into a new world of Christ all around us. Amen.